Psalm 143. Deliver me speedily. Break every oppression and heavy spirit now. There are moments when the human heart feels crushed under invisible weight, when prayers feel unanswered, and even the light of faith flickers in the winds of despair. Psalm 143 rises from such a place, a cry not from weakness, but from a soul that knows where its true deliverance lies. This psalm, attributed to David, is a desperate yet confident plea for God's mercy, guidance, and strength in the midst of deep oppression and exhaustion. It is the voice of a believer who has seen the valley of shadows and still dares to whisper, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my supplications. In your faithfulness answer me." David's prayer in Psalm 143 reflects the agony of a spirit under spiritual and emotional warfare. He is surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those he trusted, and haunted by guilt and fear. Yet in his brokenness, David does not turn to the strength of his armies or his own wisdom. He turns entirely to God. He acknowledges that no one living is righteous before him. He humbles himself completely, not demanding justice from a position of pride, but pleading for mercy from a heart that understands grace. "Deliver me speedily," he cries, not because God is slow, but because the storm has grown fierce. There is a point where the delay of deliverance feels unbearable, where the soul cries not for luxury or success, but simply for peace. This psalm becomes the voice of every believer who has ever been pressed down by a heavy spirit, trapped in cycles of fear, anxiety, spiritual oppression, or emotional fatigue. It is the prayer of the weary who still believe that God can break the net, scatter the darkness, and breathe life into what feels like dry dust. In this meditation, we will journey through 5 dimensions revealed by Psalm 143, 5 deep truths about deliverance, oppression, and the power of divine mercy. We will see how David's words unveil the mystery of spiritual warfare, the nature of the human soul under attack, and the transforming force of divine presence. These 5 movements are not just theological reflections. They are living prayers that can awaken the sleeping heart and restore the believer's fire. As we go deeper, remember this: deliverance is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the slow rising of light after a long night. Sometimes it is the quiet realization that God has been carrying you all along. The speed of deliverance does not lie in time. It lies in faith. Deliver me speedily is not a complaint. It is an act of total surrender, a call to the Eternal One to move now, not because we deserve it, but because His mercy is greater than our endurance. Let us begin with the first movement of this sacred psalm, the recognition of the cry itself. For before the deliverance comes, there must be a heart humble enough to cry out. The cry is not a sign of weakness, it is the sound of faith awakening, the cry of the oppressed. When the soul grows heavy and the spirit feels bound. Every great deliverance begins with a cry. There is no freedom without the confession of need. David opens Psalm 143, not as a warrior demanding victory, but as a servant begging for mercy. "Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In your faithfulness answer me, and in your righteousness." These are not the words of a man who still believes in his own ability to fight. These are the words of someone who has reached the end of himself. The cry of Psalm 143 is the moment when pride finally dies and true dependence on God begins. The human soul carries weight unseen. It is not just the body that grows tired, it is the heart, the inner world, the realm of emotions and thoughts that bear the brunt of invisible battles. Spiritual oppression is not a myth. It is a reality every believer faces at one time or another. It can come through fear, through guilt, through the enemy's whispers that you are unworthy, unloved, or forgotten by God. It can appear through the weight of constant failure, through betrayal, through memories that refuse to fade. These are not random struggles. They are weapons aimed at the very center of your spiritual identity. David's enemies were both external and internal. He had armies surrounding him, but he also had his conscience accusing him. He had to face not only those who sought his life, but also the consequences of his own sins and choices. This double weight, outer attack and inner guilt, is the perfect storm for oppression. It is where the mind begins to collapse under fear and the heart begins to believe the lies of darkness. For the enemy has persecuted my soul, he says. He has crushed my life to the ground. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. Notice the depth of those words, like those long dead. This is not physical death. It is spiritual numbness. It is when you breathe but do not feel alive, when you move but no longer sense God's presence. That is the worst form of oppression, the silence of the soul that no longer senses divine touch. This is where David was, yet in that silence he chose not to give up. He did not numb his pain. He prayed through it. That is what sets a chosen one apart, not the absence of affliction, but the refusal to surrender to it. The cry of Psalm 143 is a spiritual act of rebellion against despair. It says to the powers of darkness, "You can press me, but you cannot possess me. You can crush me, but I still belong to the living God." To cry out to God is to reject the narrative of defeat. The enemy wants silence. God wants your voice. Every cry of faith pierces through the heaviness like an arrow of light. That cry summons heaven's attention and activates divine movement. When the psalmist says, "In your faithfulness answer me," he appeals not to his own righteousness, but to God's covenant character. He knows that deliverance comes not from merit, but from mercy. He is saying, "I have no defense, Lord. My only defense is you." This is the posture that breaks oppression, the position of total surrender. Spiritual heaviness often comes when the believer carries what was never meant to be carried alone. Burdens of regret, anxiety, or shame become cages that lock the soul into cycles of defeat. The mind replays old wounds. The spirit loses its strength. In those moments, prayer is not a formality, it becomes survival. The breath of prayer is the soul's oxygen. Without it, oppression suffocates faith. To cry, "Deliver me speedily," is not to rush God, but to express urgency from the depths of pain. It is to say, "I cannot endure this weight another day without your touch." It is a declaration that your healing and freedom cannot be postponed. The word speedily in the psalm does not suggest impatience. It signifies spiritual desperation, the kind that moves heaven because it is rooted in truth. God is not offended by urgency when it comes from faith. He is moved by it. When you cry for deliverance, you are not reminding God of your pain. You are reminding your soul of His power. This cry is also a confession of faith against the illusion of self-sufficiency. Many believers live under silent oppression because they refuse to admit weakness. They say, "I'm fine," while their spirits are drowning. Deliverance begins when you stop pretending. David's transparency before God became his doorway to victory. He was honest about his despair, his fear, his guilt, and in that honesty, he found grace. God never despises a broken heart. He draws near to it. Every generation faces its own forms of oppression. In David's time, it was literal warfare and betrayal. In ours, it may be depression, addiction, anxiety, spiritual confusion, or the crushing weight of constant comparison. Yet the root is the same. The enemy seeks to enslave the soul in darkness. He knows that once a person loses the sense of God's nearness, they lose the strength to resist. That is why the cry must be constant. "Hear me, O Lord." Every day, every breath, until the atmosphere shifts. To cry out is to break the silence that the enemy loves. Silence is his weapon, but sound is your victory. when you pray aloud, when you worship even faintly, when you call upon God's name through tears, you shatter the stillness of despair. Your cry is not a sound lost in space. It is a vibration that moves through the spiritual realm, breaking invisible chains. Heaven listens differently to the prayer of the broken. It bends closer. Oppression thrives in isolation, but deliverance comes in communion. When David cried out, he reconnected with divine presence. That is the secret. Deliverance is not merely escape from trouble. It is restoration of relationship. My spirit is overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate, he admits. But in that same moment, he begins to remember God's works, his past miracles, his faithfulness. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all your works. I muse on the work of your hands. Memory becomes medicine. Reflection becomes resistance. When you recall what God has done before, you strengthen your faith to endure what you face now. That is the hidden power in the cry. It awakens remembrance. It brings back the light of testimony into the shadows of present pain. Every time you say, "Deliver me, O Lord," heaven recalls your covenant. You are not forgotten. You are being refined. You are not abandoned. You are being prepared. What feels like delay is often divine strategy, the space where faith matures and strength is born. So, if your spirit feels heavy, if your thoughts are clouded, if you have lost the will to pray, remember David's cry. Do not wait for perfect words. Let your tears be your prayer. Let your sighs be your offering. Cry from the center of your being, and God will hear. The same God who delivered David from caves, from betrayal, from armies and despair, he still delivers today. He breaks every invisible chain, lifts every heavy spirit, and restores breath to the weary. Before David was crowned, he learned to cry. Before he was exalted, he was humbled. The cry came before the crown. The same will be true for you. Your cry today is not weakness, it is prophecy. It declares that your deliverance is already on its way. So cry out, cry in truth, cry in faith, cry in surrender, because every cry born from faith becomes the trumpet of your deliverance. Heaven is moved by the sound of the desperate righteous, and in due time, your "deliver me speedily" will become, "He has delivered me completely." If you are walking through oppression now, do not let silence become your prison. Open your mouth, even if your voice trembles. Speak his name. Pray his word. Psalm 143 was written for such moments, moments when you have nothing left but the will to believe that God is still listening. Now, as you breathe these words, say it in your heart, "Lord, deliver me speedily," and believe that as you do, something in the unseen world is already breaking open. The Spirit of God moves not through loudness, but through authenticity. Your whisper of faith is stronger than the enemy's roar. The cry of Psalm 143 still echoes through time, an ancient song for modern pain. Let it become your prayer tonight. Let your voice rise, and let heaven respond. For when the oppressed cry, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. If this message has touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we continue this spiritual journey through the Word of God. When the soul carries a burden too heavy to name, the human heart begins to weaken under invisible pressure. There is a heaviness that cannot be seen by others, but that silently suffocates faith, draining the energy of prayer and replacing peace with inner confusion. Psalm 143 captures that secret agony with divine precision. It is not the cry of a man who lacks belief in God, but of one who feels abandoned by his presence. The weight of the soul is the most difficult cross to bear because it isolates the believer even from the comfort of spiritual emotion. When David said, "My spirit is overwhelmed within me, my heart within me is desolate," he was describing the depth of inner exhaustion that comes when every effort seems futile and every prayer echoes back unanswered. Spiritual oppression attacks the seat of strength, and that seat is the heart. It is there that the unseen war intensifies, where the enemy seeks to replace divine trust with despair. The heart of man was designed to be the dwelling place of God's Spirit. But when darkness presses in, that same heart can become a battlefield between divine truth and demonic illusion. The weight of the soul manifests in different forms. It can come as guilt that will not fade, fear that multiplies with every thought, or silence that feels like punishment from heaven. The enemy is a master of suggestion. He knows how to whisper lies that sound like truth. He convinces the weary that God has forgotten, that prayer is pointless, that deliverance will never come. And the heart, already trembling, begins to accept these lies as reality. The psalmist felt that very temptation. The heaviness he described was not only emotional, but spiritual. "He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead," he wrote, expressing the sense of being cut off from divine light. Yet even in that shadow, he remembered, he forced his soul to look back on the faithfulness of God. "I remember the days of old. I meditate on all your works. I muse on the work of your hands." In remembrance lies renewal. When the heart recalls what God has done before, it slowly begins to breathe again. But before renewal comes, there is confrontation. The oppressed soul must face the reality of its own weariness. It must stop pretending to be strong and admit its dependence. One of the greatest tricks of darkness is to convince the believer that vulnerability is failure. Yet David, the warrior king, shows us that true strength begins in confession. When you are honest about your exhaustion before God, you make room for his strength to replace your own. The heaviness of the soul often grows because we resist the process of surrender. We try to solve spiritual battles with human logic. We fight unseen forces with visible weapons, and we end up more drained than before. Deliverance begins when we stop fighting against our own healing. The psalmist's cry, "Deliver me speedily," is an admission that he could not carry the weight any longer. It is the moment of breaking where faith no longer hides behind pride. There are seasons when oppression becomes so thick that the presence of God seems absent. The prayers that once felt alive turn mechanical. The scriptures that once spoke directly to the heart now sound distant. The worship that once lifted the soul now feels like an obligation. These are not signs of spiritual failure, but of spiritual warfare. The enemy's first goal is not to destroy your life, but to silence your spirit. If he can make you stop feeling, he can make you stop believing. David knew that silence too well. His songs turned into sighs, his victories became memories, but instead of accepting that numbness as final, he chose to speak. "Hear me speedily, O Lord, my spirit fails." The honesty of those words opens the gates of divine compassion. God is not moved by pretended strength. He is drawn to real confession. The weight of the soul begins to lift when the believer stops performing and starts pleading. Every oppression that weakens the heart is rooted in separation, whether real or perceived, from divine presence. Humanity was created to live in communion with God. Sin broke that connection, and ever since, the soul has longed for reunion. David's lament reflects that ancient longing. "Do not hide your face from me, lest I be like those who go down into the pit." To lose the sense of God's face is to lose the light that gives meaning to existence. The pit he refers to is not merely death, but hopelessness, the dark realm of despair where no song can rise. When oppression weighs upon the soul, that pit becomes emotional reality. Depression, anxiety, bitterness, these are modern names for ancient torments. Yet in the midst of all of them, there remains one eternal truth. The light of God can pierce any pit, and the breath of the Spirit can reach even the lowest valley. To understand how the heart weakens under oppression, we must also understand how the spiritual realm interacts with human thought. Every negative emotion, every dark suggestion, every wave of fatigue that has no logical source can be a spiritual arrow. The psalmist's phrase, "My enemy has persecuted my soul," is revealing. He does not say my body or my reputation, but my soul. The attack is targeted at the core of identity. It seeks to distort perception, to magnify fear, and to exhaust hope. Oppression is psychological as much as spiritual. It blurs discernment, making what is temporary appear permanent. When you are oppressed, small problems look gigantic, ordinary delays feel eternal, and the smallest failures seem final. This distortion is the enemy's tool. But God, in His mercy, provides the antidote: truth. Truth realigns perception with reality. When you recall that the Lord is near to all who call upon Him, you reclaim clarity. The truth of God's faithfulness begins to push back against the lies of darkness. Still, that process is rarely instant. The believer must persist through inner resistance. There are moments in prayer when the heaviness refuses to lift, when the tears come but relief does not. Yet it is precisely in those moments that perseverance becomes power. David continued to cry even when no answer came. His persistence was proof of faith deeper than emotion. True faith is not measured by feelings, but by endurance. The oppressed heart learns that worship is not only a response to blessing, but a weapon against darkness. When you worship in heaviness, you declare that the weight cannot define your spirit. When you speak the word while trembling, you proclaim that the truth of God stands above your condition. This defiance is spiritual warfare in its purest form. Oppression feeds on passivity. When the believer stops resisting, the darkness grows stronger. But every act of remembrance, every whisper of prayer, every verse recited in faith is a strike against that oppression. David remembered, meditated, and stretched forth his hands to heaven. I stretch forth my hands unto you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. Those words reveal both desperation and direction. He does not stretch his hands toward people, power, or possessions, but toward God alone. The thirst of his soul becomes an offering, and the image of parched land teaches us that dryness is not death, it is preparation for rain. The heavier the drought, the more powerful the coming downpour. Many who walk under spiritual heaviness think something is wrong with them. They assume they have failed or lost favor, but often heaviness precedes revelation. God allows the soul to feel its emptiness so that it might fully receive His fullness. He permits silence so that His next word will resound louder than before. The night of the soul is not punishment. It is purification. When the heart has been emptied of self, it can finally be filled with spirit. David's cry, "Deliver me speedily," came not from fear of enemies, but from the recognition that without God he could not endure another moment. That is the holy desperation that moves heaven. When prayer becomes the final breath of survival, deliverance comes not as an event, but as presence. God does not always remove the source of oppression immediately, but He changes the atmosphere within the heart. The external may remain unchanged, but the internal begins to shift. The same valley that once echoed despair becomes a sanctuary of whispers from heaven. The heart begins to sense again. The scriptures start to speak again. The numbness begins to thaw. That is how deliverance often works. It does not always arrive as thunder, but as dawn. Slowly, the light breaks and the weight begins to dissolve. David's transformation within Psalm 143 is subtle but profound. He begins in lament and ends in confidence. By the end of the psalm, he says, "Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. Your spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness." The shift from despair to surrender marks the turning point. The same heart that was failing now beats with renewed purpose. This transformation is mirrored in the believer's journey. At first, oppression feels endless, but as prayer continues, revelation begins. you start to see that heaviness is not only a curse, but also a teacher. It reveals what truly sustains you. It exposes idols, false comforts, and misplaced dependencies. It teaches you to live not by sight, but by faith. The weight of the soul pushes you into the secret places where only grace can reach. And there, in the stillness of brokenness, God begins to rebuild what oppression tried to destroy. There are countless believers today who walk with outward smiles but inward fatigue. They serve, they preach, they lead, but their spirits are weary. The unseen war rages quietly within them. To such hearts, Psalm 143 offers both diagnosis and cure. It reminds them that oppression is not the end, and that weakness does not disqualify them from divine strength. For your name's sake, O Lord, revive me. That phrase is both plea and prophecy. Revival does not depend on personal merit, but on divine reputation. God delivers not because we are perfect, but because His name is faithful. When He revives the soul, He proves again that His mercy triumphs over judgment. Spiritual oppression is like a fog that blurs the landscape of purpose. Under its influence, even the brightest promises seem uncertain. That is why remembrance and meditation are essential disciplines. They anchor the soul to truth when perception falters. David practiced this discipline continually. His remembrance was not nostalgia, but warfare. Every memory of God's past faithfulness was a weapon against present fear. When you recall your deliverances, how God carried you through other storms, you weaken the grip of current oppression. Memory becomes prophecy. It declares that the God who was faithful then will be faithful now. There is also a physical dimension to this spiritual weight. Oppression often manifests in the body through fatigue, sleeplessness, or restlessness. The body mirrors the battle of the soul. That is why David not only prayed but also postured himself before God. He stretched forth his hands, he prostrated himself, he cried aloud. The physical expression of surrender mirrors the internal act of submission. When you kneel, lift your hands, or speak your prayers aloud, you align body and spirit in unified warfare. These outward gestures are not ritual, they are embodiment of faith. The heart that is weak finds strength when the body participates in worship. Yet even in all of this, the greatest act of deliverance is not removal of pressure, but restoration of perspective. The psalmist learns that God is not absent in darkness, He is hidden within it. Cause me to hear your loving kindness in the morning, for in you do I trust. Morning is not just a time of day, it is the awakening of perception. When you finally hear again, when the silence breaks and the whisper of love returns, that is morning. The loving kindness of God becomes audible to the spirit that has endured the night. This is why David's cry for speedy deliverance is answered not with explanation, but with revelation. God does not always explain the reason for the weight. He simply lifts it. And when He does, the soul learns that even heaviness has purpose. Through this journey, David discovers that oppression can coexist with divine calling. Being chosen does not mean being exempt from struggle. It means being sustained through it. The greater the anointing, the greater the warfare. But also, the greater the warfare, the greater the revelation of God's faithfulness. Every believer who carries a calling will at some point carry the weight of invisible battles. The key is not to interpret heaviness as abandonment, but as invitation, to draw nearer, to listen deeper, to depend more fully. Deliverance is not the absence of burden, but the presence of grace stronger than the burden. And so the heart begins to strengthen again. Slowly, quietly, the soul that was faint learns to breathe in rhythm with eternity. Prayer no longer feels forced. It becomes the natural language of survival. Faith ceases to be theory and becomes breath. The believer learns that even when surrounded by darkness, he is still surrounded by God. For the same Spirit that hovered over the void in creation now hovers over the desolate soul, ready to speak light again. Let there be light is not only a command for the universe, but for every human heart that has been overshadowed by oppression. When God speaks, the weight lifts, the mind clears, and the spirit rises. The journey through Psalm 143 teaches that heaviness is not a curse to flee, but a mystery to understand. It exposes what parts of the soul have not yet yielded to divine control. It invites surrender at a depth we never imagined. David's transformation from despair to dependence, from silence to song, is the blueprint of every deliverance story. The heart that once whispered, "My spirit fails," will one day declare, "Your spirit is good." The same mouth that begged for rescue will proclaim victory. The same tears that fell in darkness will shine like morning dew when the sun of mercy rises. Oppression may weaken the heart for a season, but deliverance renews it for eternity. The heavy soul becomes a vessel of deeper compassion, greater faith, and unshakable peace. For once you have walked through darkness and seen the light return, you can never doubt again that God is faithful. The weight of the soul becomes testimony. What once was pain becomes power. What once was silence becomes song. The enemy's plan to crush becomes the instrument of your strengthening. When you feel the heaviness pressing down, remember, it is not the end. It is the turning of the page. The same God who heard David's cry still listens to yours. He is near to the broken-hearted. He revives the contrite. He breathes life into weary lungs and sets captives free. No oppression is too ancient, no spirit too heavy, no chain too strong. The hand that formed the stars can lift your soul. The breath that spoke galaxies can breathe again into your despair. Deliver me speedily, you cry, and heaven moves. And when deliverance comes, it will not be subtle. It will be the moment when peace returns where there was torment. When stillness replaces chaos, when worship flows without effort, the weight will fall, and in its place will come rest, the rest that only the presence of God can give. You will know then that every tear, every cry, every sleepless night was not wasted. It was all preparation for deeper glory. The heaviness was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to make you unbreakable. If your soul feels faint, if your spirit trembles, if the silence has lasted too long, take heart. You are not forgotten. The same God who revived David will revive you. And when he does, your story will become the song that sets others free. If this message has spoken to your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel, stay close, and continue walking this journey of deliverance through the living Word of God. The hidden war within. When darkness tries to silence the spirit, there is a war that takes place far beyond the eyes of men. It is not fought with swords or visible enemies, but within the secret chamber of the soul. It is a war of thoughts, a war of fear against faith, despair against hope, silence against prayer. Psalm 143 reveals this hidden conflict with a clarity that pierces the centuries, because the same struggle that raged within David still rages within every believer today. It is the war between the spirit that seeks communion with God and the darkness that seeks to separate man from his Creator. When David cried, "Cause me to hear your loving kindness in the morning, for in you do I trust," he was not asking for sound alone. He was asking for spiritual restoration after a night of war. The darkness that surrounded him was not just the absence of light, it was the presence of opposition. Something unseen was trying to silence his spirit, to make him forget that he was chosen, to convince him that his voice no longer mattered. That same darkness still whispers to the hearts of the faithful in every generation, trying to choke the flame that God has placed within. The hidden war begins in subtle ways. It begins with distractions that grow into doubts, with disappointments that harden into disbelief, with pain that slowly poisons perspective. The enemy does not need to destroy a believer's body if he can silence the believer's spirit. When the inner voice that once cried out with passion becomes quiet, when the soul no longer reaches for heaven, oppression has achieved its purpose. David's heart was heavy because he could feel that battle within himself. His mind knew that God was faithful, but his emotions screamed abandonment. His memory held the miracles of old, yet his current circumstances felt like a contradiction to every promise. This tension, the distance between what you believe and what you feel, is the battlefield of the hidden war. It is in that distance that the enemy moves, planting lies that sound like logic, suggesting that faith is useless, that prayer is wasted breath, that deliverance is just a dream. The soul, under attack, begins to fold in on itself. Hope, once expansive, becomes small. The imagination that once envisioned divine possibilities begins to shrink under the weight of logic and fear. The believer begins to measure God's presence by emotional experience, forgetting that faith was never meant to depend on feelings. The psalmist's cry, "Cause me to know the way wherein I should walk," is the confession of a man whose compass has spun wildly under pressure. Oppression disorients, it blurs direction. When the inner war grows intense, even the simplest decisions become heavy, and clarity dissolves into fog. Yet even in that confusion, the cry itself becomes the victory. For to cry out to God is to declare that you have not surrendered to the silence. The war is not lost when the darkness comes. It is lost only when the voice of prayer stops rising. Every believer who walks deeply with God eventually faces this silent war. It comes after mountaintop moments, after seasons of revelation and victory. It is not punishment. It is proof that you are advancing. The closer you move toward divine light, the more the enemy resists. The forces of darkness do not waste energy on those who are stagnant. They rise against those who threaten their hold. That is why oppression often follows revelation. After every divine word comes an attempt from darkness to distort it. After every spiritual high comes a test of endurance. The hidden war is not a sign of divine absence, but of divine investment. God allows it not to destroy you, but to reveal to you the depth of his power within you. The faith that has never been tested cannot be trusted. The psalmist's despair became the training ground for deeper discernment. In crying out for direction, he learned to depend not on external signs, but on the inner guidance of the Spirit. In this war, the mind becomes both the battlefield and the weapon. Thoughts are not neutral. They carry spiritual weight. The enemy attacks through suggestion because he cannot create. He can only corrupt. He twists truth into half-truths, turning conviction into condemnation, patience into paralysis, discernment into suspicion. David's constant plea for guidance, "Teach me to do your will," is a defense against these distortions. He knows that if his thoughts remain aligned with God's truth, the enemy loses ground. The battle for deliverance is not won merely through shouting at darkness, but through submitting the mind to divine wisdom. Transformation begins in thought, and thought shaped by the word becomes armor. This is why the psalmist meditates, not as an empty ritual, but as strategic warfare. Meditation on divine truth replaces the enemy's lies with light, and the mind, once oppressed, becomes a sanctuary again. But the enemy's assault is persistent. He studies patterns, weaknesses, memories. He reminds the believer of past failures to imprison the soul in shame. He uses time as a weapon, making delay feel like denial, making waiting feel like abandonment. That is why David's cry for God to act speedily is so powerful. It is not the impatience of an unbeliever. It is the cry of a soldier exhausted by prolonged battle. He is not questioning God's faithfulness. He is begging for reinforcements. And God, who understands the language of broken spirits, never ignores such cries. Heaven does not measure time as earth does. The speedily of the soul is not bound to seconds or hours, but to divine readiness. When the heart reaches the end of its own endurance, God's intervention becomes immediate because His strength is perfected in weakness. During this hidden war, the believer often faces contradictions between internal and external realities. Outwardly, life may appear normal, yet inwardly, the heart feels imprisoned. The oppression that David described was not visible to his soldiers or advisors. It was a private anguish, one that could not be explained in words. That is the nature of the hidden war. It isolates. Few can understand it, fewer still can comfort it. Yet it is in that isolation that God reveals Himself most intimately. He becomes not merely the God of armies, but the God of whispers, the God who meets the soul alone in the cave. When all external help has failed, when even words of encouragement sound hollow, His presence comes silently, like light creeping through cracks in stone. Deliverance often begins in stillness, not noise. The moment you stop striving and simply acknowledge your need, divine peace begins to seep into the cracks of your soul. The psalmist's journey in this war mirrors that of every believer who has ever wrestled with depression, anxiety, guilt, or spiritual dryness. These are not mere psychological states. They are spiritual pressures that distort perception. The enemy's goal is to convince you that your current state is your permanent identity. He tells you that the joy you once knew will never return, that your passion for God is gone forever, that your mistakes have cancelled your calling. These are lies forged in the pit, and their only power lies in your agreement. When you refuse to agree, you disarm them. The truth is that the Spirit of God never leaves His chosen. Even when you feel nothing, He remains within you, interceding with groanings too deep for words. Your weakness does not repel Him, it draws Him closer. The psalmist understood this mystery when he said, "Your spirit is good." It is the revelation that no matter how dark the battle becomes, the nature of God remains unchanged. His goodness is the anchor that holds the soul when everything else shakes. As the inner war continues, the believer learns new dimensions of prayer. It ceases to be mere request and becomes communion. David's cry, repeated through every verse, is not monotonous, it is melodic. It carries rhythm and depth. The repetition of prayer under pressure builds spiritual muscle. Each plea refines intention, each sigh strengthens surrender. The prayer of the weary is not less powerful than the prayer of the strong. It is often purer, stripped of vanity and pride. When the soul has nothing left but longing, its cry becomes pure worship. That is why God treasures the tears of the oppressed. They are offerings more valuable than gold. They rise like incense from the battlefield, and heaven stores them as testimony of endurance. This hidden war is also generational. What you conquer in silence becomes inheritance for others. Every believer who fights oppression with faith paves a way for someone else to walk free. David's struggle produced songs that have comforted countless souls for thousands of years. His private battles became public deliverances. When you endure in faith, your story becomes a weapon in someone else's hand. Your scars become maps for those still lost in the dark. This is why oppression cannot win. It multiplies testimonies against itself. Every time darkness tries to silence a soul, God turns that soul into a voice of deliverance. The war that was meant to destroy ends up producing intercessors, prophets, and worshippers who carry the fragrance of divine victory. Still, the warfare remains real, and it demands vigilance. The believer must guard the mind daily, resist compromise, and cultivate awareness of spiritual atmosphere. Prayer is not a momentary act, it is continual alignment. Just as soldiers polish their weapons, so must the soul sharpen its faith. Worship, meditation, and repentance are not duties, but lifelines. In the hidden war, every moment of gratitude, every confession of trust, every declaration of Scripture is a bullet of light fired into the darkness. The enemy retreats where praise resounds. That is why David filled his lament with remembrance and promise. Even when he spoke of desolation, he also spoke of deliverance. His words carried tension between agony and assurance, yet that tension itself was proof of victory. Only those still alive in the spirit feel such conflict. The dead feel nothing. If you are struggling, it is proof that life still pulses within your soul. In the midst of this war, humility becomes the greatest weapon. Pride invites defeat because it isolates. Humility invites grace because it opens. When David said, "For your name's sake, O Lord, revive me," he stripped away every claim of self-righteousness. He understood that deliverance is never earned, it is granted. The humble heart attracts the presence of God because it leaves room for Him to act. Pride resists dependence, but humility rejoices in it. To be humble before God is not to think less of yourself, it is to think accurately about yourself, weak yet beloved, broken yet chosen. When humility replaces self-pity, oppression loses its grip. The war within shifts from chaos to calm because the soul that has surrendered cannot be conquered. Another aspect of this hidden war is the battle of memory. The enemy loves to use the past as a prison. He drags old failures into the present to convince you that the future is lost. But David teaches us to fight memory with memory, to replace the recollection of failure with the remembrance of God's faithfulness. When he says, "I remember the days of old," he is not escaping into nostalgia, he is weaponizing testimony. The believer who remembers correctly becomes undefeatable. Every past deliverance becomes a prophecy for the present. When you remind your soul that God has rescued you before, you break the illusion of permanence that oppression tries to build. The night feels endless only until you remember that the sun has always risen again. There are moments, however, when memory itself feels distant. When pain grows loud, remembrance fades. In those moments, the Spirit intercedes, the divine presence within whispers truths you can no longer articulate. It speaks scripture back to your spirit, reviving the fragments of faith left within. That inner whisper is the voice of victory. It says, "You will not be consumed. You are mine." The war within begins to shift as you agree with that voice. Alignment replaces anxiety, peace replaces panic. This is how deliverance manifests, not as thunder from heaven, but as quiet conviction that you are still loved, still chosen, still guided. To walk through this war is to learn divine dependence. The believer emerges with a deeper understanding of grace. Before the storm, prayer was a discipline. After the storm, it becomes breath. Before the battle, faith was concept. After the battle, it becomes reality. God does not waste oppression. He transforms it into intimacy. Those who have walked through darkness and found God faithful carry an authority that cannot be taught. Their words heal, their presence comforts, their prayers pierce heaven. That is why David, after surviving the weight of his own oppression, became a man after God's heart. He learned through battle what could never be learned through ease, that God's mercy is the only unbreakable thing in this world. As the psalm progresses, we see David transitioning from desperation to direction. "Lead me into the land of uprightness," he prays. The land of uprightness is not a geographical location. It is a spiritual posture, a place where the heart stands tall again after being bowed by fear. Deliverance does not always mean escape from circumstances. It often means resurrection of courage. The soul that once whispered in despair now walks in light. The heavy spirit becomes a steady one, not because the war has ended, but because victory has been internalized. The believer who once prayed, "Deliver me speedily," now walks, knowing that deliverance is not an event, but an ongoing state of grace. And so the war continues, not as torment, but as testimony. The believer who understands this mystery no longer fears darkness, because he has seen that even the night obeys God. The hidden war becomes a place of worship. Every time the enemy tries to silence you, your renewed voice becomes a declaration of triumph. Every time heaviness returns, your endurance testifies that grace is greater. The darkness no longer terrifies because it has already been used to reveal light. What once was a battlefield becomes holy ground. This is the essence of Psalm 143's revelation. The oppressed heart becomes the dwelling place of divine strength. The same place where despair once lived becomes the throne of peace. The same mind that once echoed confusion now carries the wisdom of heaven. The war within does not destroy the believer, it transforms him. It refines faith until it becomes unshakable, until trust in God is no longer dependent on sight or sound, but rooted in eternal truth. Your spirit is good, David declares, and with that confession, the war is won. Goodness triumphs not by erasing the battle, but by redeeming it. You may still feel the pressure, you may still hear the whispers of doubt, but remember, the presence of battle does not mean the absence of victory. You are still standing because grace has kept you. The fact that you still seek God, still listen, still hope, means the light has not gone out. The hidden war may be fierce, but its outcome was decided long before you entered it. Christ already conquered the darkness. Your struggle now is not for victory, but from victory. Every prayer you whisper is a reminder to the enemy that he is already defeated. Hold on through the night. Keep praying through the silence. Keep trusting when your heart feels empty. The war within will not last forever. Morning always comes, and when it does, you will rise not as the same person who entered the battle, but as one transformed by it. You will carry peace that surpasses understanding, strength that does not depend on circumstances, and a voice that carries the authority of survival. You will sing new songs, not of fear, but of freedom. And when you look back, you will see that even the darkest moments were guided by unseen mercy. The war that once terrified you will become the story that glorifies God. The oppression that once crushed you will become the platform from which you lift others. For every hidden battle carries hidden purpose, and every heavy spirit that cries, "Deliver me," will one day testify, "He has delivered me." Your deliverance is not distant, it is unfolding even now. Heaven has heard your cry, and God's Spirit moves within you like gentle wind before the storm of freedom. The heavy chains are loosening, the fog is thinning, the whisper of peace is already forming words of promise. Hold fast to this truth. The God who began the work will finish it, not slowly but perfectly, not partially but completely. If this message has strengthened your spirit, remember to subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we continue unveiling the living power of God's Word that breaks every chain and restores every weary soul. The breath of restoration. When God revives what oppression tried to kill, when the storm has raged too long and the voice of prayer has turned into exhausted silence, there comes a moment when heaven itself bends low to breathe again upon the fainting heart. The God who formed man from dust has never stopped breathing life into what seems finished. Psalm 143 reaches its quiet climax in that mystery of restoration. The movement from despair to renewal, from weakness to revived strength, from the grave atmosphere of oppression to the fresh wind of divine presence. The psalmist's cry, "Revive me, O Lord, for your name's sake," is the hinge between darkness and dawn. It is the language of one who has already been emptied and now waits not for explanation, but for breath. Every believer who has tasted heaviness knows that point, the stillness after the struggle, when words fail and only the ache remains. That is where the Spirit of God begins his most delicate work, for revival never enters through noise. It enters through surrender. Revival, in its truest sense, is not the eruption of emotion, but the recreation of inner order. Oppression disintegrates. It scatters the self into fragments of fear, regret, and fatigue. Divine breath gathers those fragments and binds them again with purpose. David's experience shows that restoration begins not outside, but within. The enemy sought to crush his life to the ground, but God raised him first in spirit before lifting him in circumstance. Every outward deliverance is preceded by an inward resurrection. The breath of God moves silently, yet its effects are thunderous. One whisper of his spirit revives what centuries of human effort could never repair. The believer who yields to that breath discovers that revival is not an event to attend, but a presence to receive. It begins where self-effort ends. When the psalmist says, "For your name's sake," he reveals the foundation of all restoration. Divine reputation. God delivers, not merely out of compassion, but out of covenant. His name is bound to his promises, and his glory is intertwined with his mercy. When he revives the crushed, he defends his own nature. This means that your restoration is not dependent on your worthiness, but on his character. The enemy accuses, reminding you of failure. God responds, reminding creation of his faithfulness. You are revived because he is faithful, not because you are flawless. Oppression loses power when this truth sinks in. The heavy spirit breathes again when it realizes that deliverance is God's responsibility. Your only task is to yield, to inhale grace where once you inhaled guilt. The breath of restoration often arrives disguised as silence. After the tempest of prayer, there is a holy stillness that settles over the weary soul. It is not emptiness, it is incubation. In that quiet, divine life rearranges the inner landscape. Memories once filled with pain begin to lose their poison. Thoughts once racing with fear begin to slow and align with peace. The heart that could not rest finally unclenches. Many mistake this stage for nothingness, but it is the most creative hour of the Spirit. Just as God formed the world in the quiet void before dawn, he recreates the believer in sacred stillness. What you call delay, he calls formation. Every deep breath you take in his presence becomes participation in creation itself, the renewal of the human spirit in harmony with divine rhythm. David's revival begins with remembrance, but ends with revelation. Through remembrance, he recalled what God had done. Through revelation, he realized what God was doing. Restoration is not the return to a former state. It is elevation into a higher one. The man who has walked through darkness does not return to naive light. He walks in tempered brilliance, humility fused with authority. The restored believer carries an awareness that cannot be learned in comfort. It is the consciousness of dependence. Before the storm, prayer may have been habit. After the storm, it becomes oxygen. Before oppression, faith may have been theory. After oppression, it becomes blood in the veins. The revived heart no longer fears weakness because it has tasted the strength that flows from surrender. Oppression tries to convince the soul that it is irreparably broken, but divine restoration is creative, not cosmetic. God does not tape together shattered pieces. He makes all things new. When he breathes, he does not merely inflate, he transforms substance. The same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells in the believer, quickening mortal bodies, renewing minds, restoring hearts. Revival, therefore, is resurrection on a smaller scale, a personal Easter within the human spirit. David felt this when he wrote, "Bring my soul out of trouble." The phrase is resurrection language. He is not asking for partial relief, but for full emergence from the grave of despair. Every true deliverance bears resurrection's mark. What was buried rises, but it rises different, stronger, infused with glory it never had before. As divine breath enters, identity is restored. Oppression distorts identity by attaching false labels: failure, forgotten, forsaken, unworthy. The revived soul hears again the ancient truth spoken at creation. You are mine. That recognition is power. The heart that knows it belongs to God cannot remain bound by what others or circumstances declare. Revival, then, is remembrance of belonging. David's restoration came when he re-anchored himself not in kingship or success, but in sonship. Before he was a king, he was a child of covenant. That identity survived every exile, betrayal, and mistake. So too with every believer, the truest self is the one hidden in God, untouched by the storms of experience. To be revived is to awaken to that hidden self again, to realize that the spirit within has never been defeated, only buried under layers of noise. In the process of restoration, divine correction often accompanies comfort. The same breath that revives also refines. David prays, "In your mercy cut off my enemies and destroy all those who afflict my soul, for I am your servant." On the surface, it sounds like vengeance, but spiritually it is purification. The enemies represent every internal alliance with darkness, every thought, habit, or attachment that cooperated with oppression. God's mercy destroys these inner oppressors, severing the soul from what enslaved it. True revival requires holy surgery. The Spirit does not merely soothe, He sanctifies. He exposes hidden idols, emotional dependencies, secret fears, and burns them away in the fire of love. What emerges from this fire is a heart lighter than before, stripped of excess, free to breathe. The believer who has undergone such purification can discern peace from comfort. Comfort can coexist with compromise, peace cannot. Peace demands purity because it flows only where truth reigns. Restoration also redefines strength. Before the breaking, David's strength was his courage, his skill, his leadership. After revival, his strength became his humility. The man who once fought lions and giants now learned to fight invisibility with worship. He realized that surrender is not weakness but mastery, the mastery of trusting God above self. Every believer who experiences revival comes to this paradox. The more dependent you become on God, the stronger you stand before men. The one who kneels the deepest rises the highest. The breath of God does not inflate pride, it restores balance. It reminds the human spirit of its true posture, upright before men, bowed before God. When that alignment is restored, oppression loses all foothold. The enemy cannot manipulate a soul that has nothing to prove. As restoration continues, gratitude becomes the new language. The revived heart no longer prays only for escape, it praises for existence. Every breath becomes testimony. The ordinary becomes holy. The simple act of waking becomes miracle. David's psalm ends not with complaint, but with confidence. His revival turned fear into song. Likewise, when God restores the believer, praise arises naturally, not as duty, but as reflex. Gratitude is the aroma of revival. It attracts further grace because it aligns the heart with heaven's frequency. Where thanksgiving flows, stagnation cannot remain. The atmosphere of gratitude repels oppression because darkness cannot inhabit the same space as praise. The revived soul thus becomes both sanctuary and trumpet, housing presence and broadcasting glory simultaneously. Restoration changes perception of time. During oppression, every moment felt heavy and endless. After revival, time becomes gift again. The soul that once begged for tomorrow now learns to live fully in today. This is the secret of sustained deliverance, learning to abide rather than anticipate. God's breath not only revives but teaches rhythm. The Spirit trains the heart to rest between beats, to find Him in the pauses as much as in the movements. David learned that daily dependence prevents future oppression. When the believer lives moment by moment in awareness of grace, darkness finds no empty room to return. Revival therefore becomes maintenance of intimacy, constant inhalation of spirit through prayer, meditation, and obedience. One of the most profound effects of divine restoration is renewed compassion. Those who have suffered deeply become healers. David, once consumed by survival, became a shepherd again, this time not of sheep, but of souls. He could comfort others because he knew the valley firsthand. Revival enlarges empathy. The revived believer carries softness even in strength, patience even in urgency, mercy even in authority. Such hearts mirror the heart of God, who revives not to create monuments but ministers. The experience of oppression becomes training for intercession. The one who was delivered now stands in the gap for those still bound. This is how the kingdom multiplies, through the recycled mercy of the restored. Oppression isolates, but restoration reconnects. When the breath of God enters, relationships once strained by fear or pride begin to heal. Forgiveness flows where bitterness once ruled. The revived soul understands that grace received must become grace extended. David, forgiven much, learned to forgive. The weight that left his heart made room for love. True deliverance always expresses itself relationally. It turns solitary survivors into compassionate servants. The spirit that revives also reconciles, weaving hearts together into a tapestry of shared redemption. In community, revival finds continuity. Fire spreads only when coals touch. Likewise, spiritual vitality grows through fellowship. Those who have breathed divine air cannot hoard it. They exhale encouragement, creating atmospheres where others can breathe too. The breath of restoration also awakens creativity. When the soul is free from oppression, imagination revives. Dreams long buried begin to stir. The Psalms themselves are evidence. David's poetry flowed from his restored heart. Inspiration follows liberation because creativity is a function of the spirit. Oppression suffocates imagination. Revival resurrects it. The believer who has been delivered begins to see possibilities again. Visions, ideas, callings and assignments that had faded in the fog return with clarity. God does not revive without purpose. Every renewed heart is a seedbed for divine innovation. What the enemy tried to kill was not merely joy but purpose. When God breathes again, that purpose erupts into fruitfulness. The life once consumed with survival begins to overflow with creation. Still, revival is not without its quiet challenges. The newly revived must learn to guard what has been restored. Just as lungs must continue to breathe to live, the spirit must continue to draw from divine presence. Neglect invites relapse. David maintained his revival through constant remembrance, writing new songs to keep his heart alive. Similarly, the believer must cultivate disciplines that sustain the breath: daily prayer, honest confession, continual gratitude. Revival without rhythm fades into emotional memory. Revival with rhythm becomes lifestyle. The key is constancy, to keep inhaling grace until it becomes the default atmosphere of thought. When the Spirit's breath becomes daily air, oppression finds no soil to root. Restoration also realigns vision. The revived believer no longer views challenges as punishment, but as partnership. Opportunities to witness God's strength anew. Trials cease to intimidate because they become invitations. Every difficulty becomes another chance to inhale divine breath and exhale faith. This is the maturity that follows revival, an unshakable calm rooted not in ignorance of pain, but in intimacy with presence. David's later psalms radiate that serenity. He had learned that no valley was void of God. Likewise, the believer who has known the breath of restoration carries stillness even in storms. This peace confuses the world because it is not logical, it is relational. It flows from knowing that the same God who delivered once will deliver again. Perhaps the most tender aspect of restoration is the return of joy. Not the superficial happiness of circumstance, but the deep laughter of spirit that knows it is safe. Joy is evidence that oppression's narrative has been replaced by heaven's truth. It is the echo of divine delight within human limitation. When joy returns, strength returns, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. David's revival culminated in dance before the ark, an outward expression of inward liberation. The one who once wept in darkness now moved freely in light. Every believer is invited into that same joy, the spontaneous celebration of being alive in God again. To rejoice after oppression is not denial of pain, it is defiance of despair. It proclaims that darkness did not win, that breath has triumphed over suffocation. As the revived heart lives in this rhythm, it becomes a beacon for others still trapped. Light attracts the lost, and the fragrance of freedom draws the bound. Without preaching, the restored life preaches. Without argument, it testifies. David's life after deliverance became a living psalm, and so does yours. The world hungers not for flawless saints, but for breathing testimonies, people whose eyes still glisten with the memory of tears, but whose voices resound with songs of mercy. That authenticity carries authority. The credibility of deliverance is found in the scars that remain, yet no longer bleed. Eventually, the believer realizes that restoration was never merely personal. God revives individuals to revive generations. The breath that enters one heart spreads through families, communities, nations. Revival is contagious because the Spirit is communal. The air of heaven cannot remain confined. It expands wherever there is openness. Every act of obedience, every word of faith, every moment of worship releases fragrance into the atmosphere, purifying environments poisoned by despair. This is how oppression is truly broken, not only in the individual, but in the collective consciousness of those who witness transformation. The revived become catalysts, walking reminders that God still breathes into dust. And yet, even as the psalm concludes, David remains humble. His final declaration, "I am your servant," seals the restoration. Servanthood is the crown of revival. The revived do not boast, they bow. They understand that all life is borrowed breath, that every victory belongs to the giver of life. Gratitude evolves into devotion, and devotion becomes lifelong service. The one who was delivered now delights to deliver. The one who was revived now lives to revive. This is the full circle of Psalm 143, from oppression to surrender, from surrender to revival, from revival to service. The heavy spirit becomes the holy vessel. If you find yourself today in the aftermath of battle, breathing but bruised, standing yet shaken, know that restoration is not a dream, it is a promise. The same God who revived David is breathing over you now. You may not feel wind, but faith will feel it first. As you sit quietly and whisper his name, air from eternity fills your lungs. The weight begins to lift, not all at once, but certainly. Memories that once tormented lose authority. Fears that once screamed fade to whispers. You are being recreated. The ashes are turning to beauty, the lament into melody, the despair into destiny. This is not imagination. It is divine procedure, the resurrection protocol of mercy. So breathe again, inhale grace, exhale gratitude. Let the breath that formed galaxies form peace within you. Let the spirit that moved over chaos move through you. Let the name of the Lord be the air you live in. And as you rise, carry that breath into your world. Speak life where others speak death, hope where others predict ruin, light where others surrender to gloom. You are not just delivered, you are appointed as a carrier of deliverance. The same wind that set you free now flows through your voice, your presence, your prayer. Wherever you go, oppression will tremble because revival travels with you. Thus, Psalm 143 ends, not in lament but in life. The heavy spirit has become the breathing soul. The once silent mouth now declares the goodness of God in the land of the living. And somewhere in the unseen, the breath that revived David continues its journey, passing from generation to generation, from heart to heart, until every captive knows the sound of freedom. If this word has stirred your heart and reminded you to breathe again in God's presence, subscribe to the channel. Remain close to this journey of faith, and let the living word continue to breathe strength, peace, and divine restoration into your soul every day. The light after the storm. Living free from every oppression. When the storm has passed, and the heart begins to breathe again, something sacred happens. The believer realizes that deliverance was never only about escaping pain, it was about transformation. The light after the storm is not the same light that existed before. It is softer, wiser, and more intimate. In Psalm 143, David's final words reveal that freedom is not achieved by force, but received through surrender. For your righteousness bring my soul out of trouble, and in your mercy cut off my enemies. The journey that began with desperation ends with devotion. The man who once begged for survival now stands as a servant of divine peace. Deliverance is not a moment. It is a new way of seeing, a new way of living, a new way of trusting. To live free from oppression means to live aware of grace. Oppression thrives in blindness, but revelation brings sight. David, once suffocated by fear and guilt, now perceives clearly. The same God he thought was silent had been working within the silence all along. That realization changes everything. Freedom begins not when the problem disappears, but when the soul understands that the presence of God never left. The light after the storm teaches that divine love was hidden even in the pain, shaping faith, refining endurance, and preparing the spirit for deeper intimacy. Once you see that, darkness loses its threat. The soul that recognizes God's hand in suffering cannot be easily shaken again. The aftermath of oppression is clarity. When the storm rages, everything seems chaotic and senseless, but when the light returns, you see what the darkness was hiding. You see that some losses were actually protection, some delays were preparation, and some tears were intercession. God never wastes a storm. The enemy wanted to destroy, but God used the same winds to redirect your course. That is why David could pray with confidence, "For your name's sake, O Lord, revive me." He understood that every revival in his life existed for the glory of God's reputation. Freedom is not personal triumph, it is divine testimony. When you rise from oppression, heaven celebrates because your restoration reveals God's nature. His mercy becomes visible through your story. The first lesson of freedom is remembrance. To remember what God has done is to keep your heart humble and protected. Forgetfulness invites bondage. Remembrance builds gratitude. David never erased the memory of his caves or his tears. He remembered them so that praise would never become performance. Every believer delivered from heaviness must guard this discipline. Gratitude is the air of liberty. Without it, the soul suffocates again. When you remember the pit from which you were drawn, arrogance cannot return. You know that every breath is grace, every morning mercy, every heartbeat miracle. That awareness keeps the atmosphere of deliverance pure. Freedom also requires vigilance. The enemy who once oppressed does not vanish. He only changes tactics. If he cannot crush, he will distract. If he cannot possess, he will deceive. The believer must guard the gates of thought, emotion, and speech. Oppression re-enters subtly through worry, offense, or pride. That is why David ends the psalm with the confession, "For I am your servant." Servanthood anchors freedom. When you live submitted to God's authority, deception loses its doorway. To serve is to remain awake, humble, and protected. The liberated heart continually bows before the one who delivered it, knowing that dependence is the secret of stability. Living free also means sharing freedom. The one who has been healed carries healing in their voice. David's deliverance became the Psalms that have liberated countless others. Your testimony is not yours to hide. It is an instrument of divine mercy. The enemy's plan was to silence you. God's plan is to make your voice an anthem. Tell what God has done. Speak of his faithfulness in your darkest hour. Every story of redemption weakens the kingdom of darkness and strengthens the faith of those still in the fight. Your freedom is someone else's invitation to believe again. Freedom is sustained through relationship. Deliverance is not independence. It is restored intimacy. The same cry that began Psalm 143, "Hear my prayer, O Lord," must continue as daily rhythm. The liberated soul does not abandon prayer after victory. It deepens it. Each morning becomes covenant renewal, each night reflection of gratitude. The believer learns that prayer is not an emergency exit, but the breath of life. The one who prays continually cannot easily fall again into oppression, because the presence that delivers is the same presence that preserves. After freedom, the soul sees suffering differently. What once felt like punishment now appears as purification. You understand that the storm did not break you, it burned away illusions. Every difficulty revealed something hidden, fear, dependence, pride, and once exposed, it lost power. The free heart now interprets pain as divine dialogue, not divine distance. It asks, not why, or but what are you teaching me here? That perspective turns future trials into classrooms of revelation. The one who has seen God redeem pain no longer fears it. Darkness may visit, but it cannot dwell where faith has learned to see through it. Worship also changes after deliverance. It becomes quieter yet deeper. There is no more striving to feel something. There is resting in what is known. The song of the delivered carries a tone of eternity. It does not beg, it beholds. David's worship after his trials was no longer the cry of a desperate man, but the melody of a restored one. True freedom produces spontaneous praise. You thank God not only for what he did, but for who he proved himself to be. That gratitude becomes armor. Where praise abides, oppression cannot breathe. Every expression of thanksgiving is a declaration that the storm failed. Freedom exposes false dependencies. During bondage, the soul clings to substitutes, habits, relationships, or distractions that promise comfort but deliver emptiness. Once the Spirit revives you, those things lose taste. You find joy not in escape, but in presence. The revived heart no longer needs noise to feel alive. It finds fulfillment in stillness. The light after the storm simplifies life. You no longer crave validation or control. You learn to be content with the quiet companionship of God. This simplicity is strength. It leaves no handle for darkness to grab. The free soul is untouchable because it has nothing to lose except grace itself. Freedom deepens compassion. Those who have been broken become gentle. The delivered recognize pain in others without judgment because they remember what it felt like to despair. Oppression isolates, but deliverance reconnects. The once crushed spirit becomes a vessel of comfort. God uses the wounds of the healed to reach the wounded. This is why freedom is never private. You were delivered not just to rejoice, but to restore. The same mercy that lifted you now flows through you. Every kind word, every prayer for another, every act of forgiveness extends your deliverance further into the world. To live free also means to guard peace. Peace is not absence of trouble, it is presence of order. David, after being delivered, learned to rule not by sword, but by song. The same principle applies to the believer. Peace governs better than control. The enemy will try to pull you back into reaction, but the free soul learns stillness. It responds instead of reacts, prays instead of panics, forgives instead of fights. This posture maintains the open sky of grace under which deliverance thrives. When peace becomes habit, oppression cannot regain territory. Another sign of lasting freedom is joy, not the shallow happiness of success, but the deep laughter that flows from being truly alive. Joy is evidence that darkness no longer defines you. When joy returns, strength returns, because the joy of the Lord is your strength. The once oppressed now laughs not because everything is easy, but because nothing can steal what matters most, God's presence. This laughter is holy defiance. It proclaims that every storm served its purpose and nothing was wasted. Joy after pain is resurrection manifested. It is proof that life has triumphed over heaviness. Freedom matures into wisdom. You begin to see the patterns of grace, that what felt like delay was protection, that every no hid a greater yes. Understanding replaces frustration. You stop arguing with time and start cooperating with it. Patience becomes peace. The believer who has been delivered no longer rushes. They walk. They no longer demand answers. They discern seasons. The calm that once seemed impossible becomes natural. This is how deliverance becomes identity. You no longer fight for peace. You live from it. Ultimately, freedom leads to service. The final act of the psalm, I am your servant, summarizes the purpose of every deliverance. God rescues not just to relieve pain, but to restore purpose. The one who was oppressed becomes a carrier of divine compassion. You serve not out of obligation, but gratitude. Every moment becomes an offering, every breath worship. This is the highest form of deliverance, to live as testimony. Your peace preaches louder than words. Your presence carries the fragrance of grace. Wherever you go, freedom travels with you. If today you find yourself breathing after a long storm, remember this: you are already standing in victory. The weight that once crushed you has become the foundation on which faith stands firm. The darkness that terrified you has become a mirror reflecting divine light. You have seen God's mercy in the deepest night. You will never again doubt his dawn. Walk now in that freedom. Guard it with humility. Share it with courage. Let every day be proof that the God who delivered David still delivers those who cry out. Let your life itself become the psalm, a living song that says, He revived me for his name's sake, and his mercy endures forever. If this message has touched your spirit and reminded you of God's enduring mercy, subscribe to the channel and stay with us as we continue to walk through the living word that restores, strengthens, and fills the soul with divine peace and light.